The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to Lunch and Learn. Welcome to this session on getting the best from people. Warm welcome to you all, and hope you all have a great weekend, and look forward to working with you in the next hour. Could I just make sure that I'm being heard, that the sound's working well? Could you just type in the word clear over in the question box? That would be great. I'll know that I'm coming across loud and clear. So, how are we going with that? Nothing so far. I don't know what that means. I'm coming across or you can't hear me. So, okay, let's have a look. Okay, thanks, John. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Margaret. Okay. I'm assuming that I am coming across loud and clear, which is good to know. Okay, so if you've got any questions, of course, as usual in today's session, then I'd ask you to type them into that question box there, and that way I can deal with it at the time. So now let's talk about this business of getting the very best from people. You might recall that last time we spoke, we did talk around a lot of. You might recall the 10 top things that people wanted in their job in the last session 2 weeks ago, and some of you were quite surprised by the some of the things that people were after in a job. But the bottom line is that if you were attempting to apply all of those things in your leadership, then it's likely that you'll hit the mark with each person, because we know, that, of course, that motivation is an individual choice. And the important thing is, of course, to try lots of things. And that was the purpose of the last session. So you've got there on your screen now a list of the units that we're covering, and we're well and truly into the program now, of course. And you'll find that when we get down to Unit 5, I'll be giving you another diagnostic to do, which is around understanding people and their personalities. This one won't be an electronic version. I'll be sending you a paper version tomorrow, actually on the weekend. So you'll get that early next week. And I would like you to complete it so that when we meet again in a fortnight, you have got your personality profile done, and as a result of that, I can do a debrief for an hour on that. So that's the 5th session, and the final session that we're going to look at is how to facilitate effective meetings, which is an important topic, because I think all of us, as I have said earlier, in the program, spend lots of times at meetings. You could argue that you're at a meeting now, and as soon as you finish here, you're probably on to another meeting, and it never ends. And many of those meetings, of course, as managers, you have to actually lead. And it's good to get good at running good meetings. And the reason for that is that it will help you significantly, because meetings are expensive. Getting lots of people around a table does cost money. It doesn't come onto the balance sheet, but it's very clear that it's costing money, because people, while they're at the meeting, can't be doing something else. And so therefore it's double time. Not only are they spending a time with you, but they're also not spending a time doing an hour, if it's an hour meeting, doing something else. So it becomes quite significant. All right, so let's get into today's program. Now, your homework last time was to, and remember all of the work that we did on motivational theory. What we were attempting to do was really to distill it down to 3 important key elements. And the 3 important key elements was autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So giving people the freedom of choice about how they do their business within reason, of course. Some things have to be done a certain way. and you know, it's important for you to clarify what that is. And mastery, of course, is the ability to build capability individually so that the team member feels that they've got all the tools that they need in order to continue to perform at a reasonably high level. And of course, purpose is all about the notion of giving people a why. So why am I asking you to do this? What's the big picture? What's the cause? What's the net effect of not doing this job right or doing this job right? Those things, I think, are really important. And really, what I'm asking you to do is to have spent a bit of time working with people around these three concepts that Daniel Pink talks about in his book Drive. So I hope you've had some good experiences with that, and I'm quite comfortable with you in the question box, just giving me a little bit of feedback about what's been happening since we talked last. So if you choose to do that, go for your life. So that's important. Now, we talked, I think, about the concept of being your primary role as a leader is to get the very best from each team member. And really, I think it's not about having everyone at a 10 out of 10, which obviously is ideal, but it's probably not realistic. The best you might be able to do is get a 10% improvement. So if someone might be a 5 out of 10, the question then is how do we get them to a 6 out of 10? Or someone's a 3 out of 10, how do we get them to a 4 out of 10? So it's always about chipping away at trying to build capacity, to build performance, and challenging people and looking for ways and means of doing that. And I think I mentioned this last time that if you've got 5 people in your team and you can improve their performance by 10%, each of them, then you've obviously increased your overall team performance by at least 50%, which is significant. So, the topic here is really about how we do get that extra 10% from people that we lead. So there are a number of ways of doing that, but at the end of the day, the critical skill in all of this is to learn to have good, productive conversations. And I think that a lot of us are bypassing that responsibility because we're interested, of course, of using email instead of having conversations with people because it's convenient. It might be convenient, but it's not necessarily effective. So I can say to you that there's a high correlation between getting the best out of other people and your ability to have good performance and development conversations with people on a regular basis. So the theme very much of today is around having conversations. So if we're going to have better conversations with people, and I'm not just talking about the hard conversations, I'm not just talking about the performance conversations, I'm talking about any conversations, because at the end of the day, you and I are dealing with human beings. And because we're dealing with human beings need to feel that they are, they're conversing with you. And how you converse, of course, is by having a conversation. So what I want to do is talk about some of the barriers around conversations, because if it was that simple, then everybody, of course, would be having regular, meaningful dialogue. But of course, I know that doesn't happen. Excuse me. It doesn't happen in lots of organisations for lots of reasons. So the first thing I really want to look at is what the barriers are to having a conversation culture. What's stopping you? Now, some of these barriers are psychological, some of these barriers are physical, some of these barriers are cultural. So I want to have a look at those barriers, and while I'm going through these barriers, I'd like you to have a think about if any of those barriers are actually getting in the way of you being able to have meaningful dialogue with the people that you lead. I want to share with you a framework that I developed a couple of years ago, which is now being used all over the world, I'm proud to say, in lots of organisations in the public sector, the private sector and the not-for-profit across 21 industries. And it's called the 5 Conversations Framework. In fact, it's so effective, some people have decided to get rid of their performance reviews, and you might be sitting there thinking, well, I don't think we can do that. Well, you don't need to do that, but some people have gone down that road of actually taking out performance reviews and using the 5 Conversations Framework as a substitute. Now, if you can't get rid of performance reviews, and I know many of you in the public sector, and that's just not going to happen, then you can use the 5 Conversations Framework as an enabler. That is to improve, by having ongoing dialogue, to improve the ability to be having meaningful performance conversations. And finally, I'll share with you 5 more developmental conversations that you might like to consider in your journeys. So the whole theme of today is how do you have better conversations with the people that you lead, because that is the essence of getting the very best out of people. So let's look first of all at some sobering statistics, and they really are sobering when you look at these statistics. Let's look, for example, that here are some statistics, and they're coming up on your screen now. 79% of organisations that were surveyed by Deloitte worldwide struggle to engage and retain their employees. Now, that won't be a surprise to you. In fact, the surveys consistently show that about 70% of people are disengaged at work, which means basically that only 30% are engaged, whatever that might mean. So that's obviously not a good starting point. Another statistic that's important here is that a whopping 86% of organisations believe they don't have an adequate leadership pipeline to address these problems. So in other words, they're just not growing leaders, and they're in a situation where they're going to be in a crisis in the future because they don't have good leaders being grown in the organisation to move on and succeed other leaders as they move out. So that's an issue. 90% of leaders rely on their own ideas rather than seeking involvement from their team. Now that's the perception of the team members, 90%. And even worse is that 89% of leaders fail to listen or respond to interpersonal cues from those they interact with. At least that's the perception of the employees that were surveyed. So that's pretty significant, isn't it? So a lot of people do not believe that their leader is engaging in meaningful dialogue with them. And whether that's a perception or whether it's a reality, it's a perception at least in the minds of the perceiver. And so in that case, it's really factual. And for all intents and purposes, that's what people think, which is quite startling when you think about it. Disturbingly, only 5% of leaders are effective at building trust in their interactions with team members. Are you in that 5% or are you in that 95%? And it's probably easy for you to answer that, but what might your team members actually say about you in relation to your ability to build trust? So really, I don't think it's any great art form to build trust. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just about being authentic, genuine, open, considerate, empathetic. All of these things that get drummed into all of us in these leadership programs are really, combined leads to a perception of trust. So it's important that we build that trust up, and conversations is one way of doing that. 60% of employees felt their self-esteem was dented by their leader at work. So that's the majority of people. These people would rather do almost anything else than sit through a performance conversation with their boss, although they did acknowledge that a good boss with excellent interaction skills would enhance their productivity by as much as 60%. So the opportunity is there for us to be having more meaningful conversations. And I often believe that these conversations are not conversations that happen in a formal sense. The very best conversations are ones that are done in the corridor, what I would call the corridor conversations. These are the conversations that we have between meetings. These are the unguarded moments where you'll get pulled up and you may feel annoyed about it, but sometimes those conversations are actually the best conversations, but very rarely do we talk about those. 79% of employees who quit their job cite a lack of appreciation as a key reason for leaving. Now, again, it's a perception, but if people in this survey suggest that they haven't been appreciated by their leader, and that is their reason for leaving, well, that's disturbing. But the good news is it's very easy to resolve that. And I know some of you probably wish some of your team members would leave. But the ones, of course, the old saying is the only rats that leave a sinking ship are the ones that can swim. So therefore, the ones that do decide to leave are the ones that are capable of getting a job somewhere else, and the ones that decide to stay are the ones that feel like they're captive to the audience, to the organisation. They're what we might refer to as the professional resistors, and they tend to stay. So these are not good statistics, are they? 65% of North Americans report that they didn't receive any recognition in the previous year. 65%. Now, I suspect that probably many of them did receive recognition and they probably didn't realise that they'd received recognition. You know, a thank you or I appreciate the job you did here on the, set on the run. People can easily forget that after a while, but still in all, 65% is quite high. So we've got to give people more recognition. We've got to thank people for the work that they do. And we've just got to, as I have referred to in my latest book that's out this week, is we've got to bring the human being back to work is essentially what we should be aiming to do. Now, let's talk about conversations a little bit more because pretty much the thrust of what we're doing here in this hour is on the whole notion of having better quality conversations with people. Now, I'm not talking about chit-chat, of course. I'm talking about meaningful conversations around their development or even their performance or both. So a couple of things that are important about conversations. In one of my books, which I co-authored with Aubrey Warren, we talk about organisations as our conversations. In other words, if you looked at organisations, it's really just hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of conversations going on each day. So one of the ways of looking at organisations is not just looking at the bricks and mortar or even what people do, but to actually consider that organisations are just conversations going on all the time. It's a good place to start our discussion because at the end of the day, the people that work for you, I think, are all human. They happen to be human beings first and employees second, not employees first and human beings second, as I think a lot of people do consider. And sometimes they don't even consider the human being aspect. Now, I'm not talking about being warm and soppy here because some of these conversations you've got to have with people are quite tough. So organisations are really a series of conversations. They go on the lunchroom, they go on the boardroom, they go on the road, they go on in the toilet, they go on everywhere. Some are long, some are short, some are interesting, some are boring, some are structured, some are unstructured, some are useful, some are unuseful. It goes on and on and on. But organisations are just, as I said, a series of conversations. So the good quality conversations, I'm afraid, are starting to diminish. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we are too reliant on technology, specifically texts and also email. And what we're tending to do is we're sending people texts or emails when we should simply pick up the phone or just go over to their alcove or wherever they are and just have a conversation. And I think that this is quite problematic. And how often have you got a email from someone when really they could have just simply come up and talked to you about the issue, got your feedback and walked away the wiser? So good quality conversations, I think, are on the wane. And I think that what's happening is that there are lots of organisations, including mine, who are now training people to have conversations. And I think it's interesting that if your parents were alive today and you actually, you got an opportunity to talk to them and you said to them, guess what, Mum and Dad, we're having conversations, we're having training to have conversations at work, I think they would be quite amused. I think they'd laugh out aloud, because that's how far removed in, say, 25 years we've become to the idea of having regular conversations, to the point where we think we need to have some sort of training. Which brings me to the next point. The next point is that we often use this phrase, do we not? The art of conversation. Now, I don't think there's any art to it at all. I have to concede that some of the really tough conversations that you and I have to have do require a skill set, no doubt. But let's face it, the majority of conversations that we have day to day, moment by moment, situation by situation, really don't require any art form. And the reason for that is we're having them all the time. It's not like when it's a foreign thing to us. We're having conversations regularly. I mean, imagine if you could count up the number of conversations you had over the course of the last week. It would be significant. So we get plenty of practice at it. So I'm not necessarily sure it's an art form, although, as I say, there are some tough conversations that do require skill level, but unfortunately we're not having any pleasant conversations either. So it does beg the question, have we lost the need for conversations? I don't think so. I think conversations will always be here. They've always been here and they always will be here. And I think that technology can actually help us in this regard. I think if you look at teleconferencing, for example, you can have some great conversations with people in distant places that you wouldn't have been able to do previously, which is far more effective than the telephone, because you can see them and read their body language and they're more engaged and all the rest. But unfortunately, technology is a double-edged sword, isn't it? It also stops us having the conversations because we feel that we can just send people an email or a text. I was speaking with a manager a couple of weeks ago, and he said to me, Tim, I love your 5 conversations framework, and I really would love to implement it in our organisation. And then there was a bit of an awkward pause, and then he said, well, the only problem is we don't have time for conversations. And I didn't quite know how to react to that, really, but I felt like saying, well, I did say, I said, what do you mean? Do you mean you don't have any conversations? He said, oh, no, we have work-related conversations. We have task-related. Of course, we have those sort of conversations, but, we haven't got time for any other conversations. And I just thought that was quite amusing, that really there were hundreds of thousands of conversations going on every day, but he wasn't recognising those as conversations. So we all have time for conversations. And if we don't, we make time, because this is the essence of what good leadership is about. Now, 2 colleagues of mine in the United States, Barry Posner and Jim Kuzner, who are prolific authors and consultants in the space of leadership, wrote in a book called Credibility, which is a great title. It's a great book too. It's called Credibility. And in that book, in the very first chapter, they came up with the phrase, leadership is a conversation. Sorry, leadership is a relationship. Leadership is a relationship. I thought that was a brilliant phrase. So what they're arguing in the book, if you want to get a good read, you can certainly get hold of that book. But what they were basically saying is that you in order to be a decent leader, you've got to have a professional working relationship with the people that you lead. Now, I think that makes sense to all of us. I don't mean a personal relationship. I'm talking about a professional business relationship. Now, my question to Barry Posner and Jim Kuzner is, and it's a rhetorical question, I didn't actually ask them this, but my question is, how do you have a relationship? How do you have a relationship with someone? And you know what the answer is? One conversation at a time. There is no other way. One conversation at a time. That's how we build relationships. In fact, there is no other way. There is no other way that I know. You can't build a relationship with someone on email. You can sort of build a relationship up with social media, but it's not really a multi-dimensional relationship. So the only essence of building a relationship with someone is one conversation at a time. So I just want to set the scene before we go any further to say that we really have very little choice but to sit down and have conversations with people if we're going to improve performance. And if people don't trust you, if people don't understand you, if people don't know where you're coming from, people don't understand your priorities, then it's time for you to have a conversation with people, because you will not get the best out of people unless you converse with them. That's the bottom line. So, any questions, comments, observations? I've thrown a lot of things at you there, and if you've got something that you'd like to say, then type it in the question box. I'd be more than happy to take it, and I'd be more than happy to respond to it. Okay, so while you might be thinking about that, let's move on. So I mentioned earlier that I'd talk about the barriers around having conversations or communication in general, and I want to run through those and have a think for yourself whether or not these things are applicable to you. So I've selected 9 barriers here, but I'm sure there are more, and some of these, of course, will be more they'll be more significant than others. But when you look at your organisation, have a think about which of these barriers are getting in the way of having decent conversations. They aren't necessarily in any order either, and the first one will come up on your screen right now. And the first one that I'm going to deal with is the inattention during conversations. All right, now we've all experienced either being on the receiving end or perhaps done it ourselves, where somebody comes into your office or into your alcove area or wherever you're positioned, and they start wanting to have a conversation with you about something. And while they're doing that, of course, you're busily tapping away on an email, and you probably out of courtesy would say to them, look, keep talking, I'm listening, I've just got to knock out this email before I finish. How many times has that happened to you and all of us for that matter? Now, the problem with that, of course, is that, the email probably isn't getting the attention it deserves. The second problem is you're probably not listening as closely and intently as you probably can to what the person's actually trying to communicate with you. And so what's happening is that both tasks are suffering, but you are doing this under the guise of multitasking. You think that you can multitask. Can I tell you that the research shows clearly that our brains actually aren't good at multitasking? This is a myth that we can do 2 things at once. Well, we can all do 2 things at once, but we won't do them equally capably. The other message it sends the person who's hovering over you, wanting to have the conversation, of course, is that your email is at least, if not more, important than the conversation that I'm having with you. And that's problematic, of course. So it's important that we down tools, and of course if the email is significantly important, then just say to the other person, look, I just need to finish this email, I'll come over to you as soon as I've finished. Or if you think the other person's point is more important than the email, then close the laptop or turn your turn your chair towards them and listen to what they have to say. That is a far better use of your time than it would be just to try and do two things at once in a fairly shoddy way. Now, Warren Bennis, the great management consultant, talked about the management of attention, which is a great phrase, and his argument is pretty much that our biggest challenge now in the 21st century is the capacity to manage where we pay attention. So he argues that we're getting so many distractions we're getting bombarded from all corners, everywhere. You know, email, social media, meetings with the boss, crises, it goes on and on and on and on. It's relentless. And the key for us, really, as leaders, is to learn how to manage our attention. Because if we can do that, we're going to be in a better position to be able to know what our priorities are, if you like. Another barrier is the fact that you'll get told on a need-to-know basis. Have you ever heard that? Or no news is good news. So what managers often rationalise is that I will restrict my information channels to only those things that are, in my view, of a high priority. The disturbing problem with that, of course, is that the employee believes that you don't trust them, and probably there's some truth to that. And in fact, a worse assumption is that we can't trust people with sensitive information. Well, we all accept the fact that there are certain things that can't be discussed, undoubtedly. But if you're in doubt, then communicate it. That'd be my message to you. So if we're not communicating with people, and if we're not giving them the same perspective that we have, in other words, they have the same information, then how in heaven's name can we expect them to have the same point of view? So we need to open up the information channels. We need to communicate with people and let them know. And the surveys show clearly that people are often have a gripe about not being told what's going on. That's a significant impediment to communication, that we are very selective about what we tell employees. Another barrier to communication generally, and I've been banging on about this, in fact our whole unit was on feedback, and really we Australian managers are very poor at giving feedback. Now there might be a range of reasons for that, but nevertheless we're very poor at it, and so what we do is we don't say anything. And because we don't say anything, the person second guesses about whether or not they're doing the job right or not. And that's not good, because we human beings actually need feedback. We need to know, as I said earlier in the series, we actually need to know where the line in the sand is. And if we don't know where the line in the sand is, then we feel very insecure about that. So one of the things that I really want you to get out of this Lunch and Learn series is the importance and value of regular, persistent and consistent feedback. So that's a barrier. If you don't give feedback to people, then what happens is that you're creating a communication barrier between yourself and the other person. So make sure that you're giving positive and negative feedback on a regular basis. And if you're doing that, then you're likely to be communicating more effectively, and you're likely to be hearing some of the things that are going on around the organisation. So give regular feedback. It's critically important. I must tell you an amusing story. I was working in a large organisation, and one of the people in the organisation had only been there for 6 weeks. In fact, she was 19 years old. It was her first job, and she basically said to me, I said to her actually, how have you settled in? And she said, oh, look, I don't know. I said, what do you mean you don't know? And she said, oh, my boss hasn't given me any feedback. I said, would you like me to contact your boss and suggest that he sit down with you? And she said, oh, that'd be great. So I moseyed on over to the boss's office, and he was sitting behind his big black mahogany desk with his half-moon glasses on, and I said, "Can I have a word?" And he said, "Sure." I said, "You remember, we'll call her Mary." I said, "You remember Mary? She started 6 months ago." And he said, "Oh, yes, I do. I remember Mary. She's settling well." And I said to him, "Well, she's not sure whether she's settling well. And I'm just wondering whether it might be possible for you to give her that feedback because she'd appreciate it." And he looked at me over his half-moon glasses, and there was a very awkward silence. And he said, "Look," he looked at me and he said, "Oh, I couldn't do that." And I'm thinking, why? I wonder why, I didn't know. That was a very unusual response to me suggesting he should give feedback. I said, "Well, do you mind if I ask why?" And I'm thinking to myself, maybe they're having an affair or there's some conflict of interest I don't know about. But anyway, he said to me, his answer was, "Well, if I give Mary feedback, I'll have to give everybody feedback." Wow. Anyway, I was rendered speechless and I didn't quite know what to say to that. But look, the bottom line is make sure that you're giving regular feedback. Now, the other problem, of course, that a barrier that gets in the way is that we have developed this culture of answering questions, not asking questions. And I dare say that you in this broadcast today have probably got highly honed technical skills. And anyone that's got good technical skills has actually learned through a trade or a university course or something. They have learned how to answer questions. That's what technical training does. It helps you answer questions. So you've been conditioned into the notion that you should be answering questions. But really, as a leader, you should be asking questions, not answering questions. So I would encourage you to be asking more questions and not answering questions. And the questions, of course, need to be open-ended. Why, what, where, how, who, and which. By asking any questions that start with those words, you're likely to get more than a yes or no. So why did you say that? Who was involved? How did it take place? And so forth and so on. So get in the habit of asking questions. Because if you don't ask questions, it's very hard to have a conversation with someone. So, if you ask me what the key skill of a good conversationalist is, it's simple. They ask a lot of questions and they open the other person up to an opportunity where they can have a one-on-one dialogue. So ask more questions. We've just got a comment here I'm just going to deal with. Thanks, Thor. Is it out of line for me to give feedback to upper management or even a CEO? It's not out of line. You just got to be a little bit prudent about it, a bit careful, because some people don't appreciate feedback from what they might perceive to be subordinates. So I'd say proceed with caution, and the best way to give feedback up the line is to ask people if they would like some feedback. So the way I might do that is I might walk up to my boss and I might say, "Do you mind if I give you a little bit of feedback?" Now, if I ask that question, it's courtesy because, after all, they can say no. More than likely, they'll say yes. Doesn't mean they're going to receive the feedback well, but at least I've now opened the door. I've asked permission, so to speak, and then I can give the feedback. So tread carefully, Thor, but the point about that is it's okay to do it, but you've got to pick your mark and make sure that you're on solid ground when you do it. So that's the answer to that one. Yeah, well, Thor's actually saying, yes, it's positive feedback. Well, that's not so risky, is it? Most of us don't mind getting positive feedback. And if that's the case, then I think it's more than helpful. But I think it's important to at least ask if you can give them feedback. It's just courtesy. Now, another barrier to communication is too much formality. What I mean by that is that often these conversations, when they do occur, happen in the boss's office. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that it's your territory. So the other person that you're having the conversation with isn't quite as open as they normally would be, because they know it's your office, they know it's your territory. You're far better off having a really good conversation with someone in a neutral space, in a cafeteria, or perhaps out in a coffee shop, or perhaps booking a room away from your office. If you really want dialogue, if you really want that person to open up, then that's the way to do it. So another barrier is this idea of having conversations in the boss's office. It doesn't always work very well. Now, the sixth barrier, and I've mentioned it several times already, is the notion of an over-reliance on email. Now, email is a great tool, let's be clear about it. And we do know from surveys that the average person spends 2.5 hours a day on email, right? That's what the norm is. That's the average. So you might want to think, am I above average or below average in that sense? Now, I don't doubt for a minute that a lot of those emails are critically important, but I want you to ask yourself a serious question when you're completing or about to contemplate sending someone an email. Is this the best mode of communication for this? Or is it better for me to have a conversation with the person about this? And if it's the latter, then I'd suggest to you that you should just, leave the email and go and speak to the person personally. So that's number 6 on the list. Number 7 is a lack of role models in the organisation. Now, I apologise, we've got 2 white males here, and I'm talking about role models, and that could somebody completed these slides for me, and ironically they were female, but I just noticed that it's sort of a little bit of perhaps unconscious bias or something. But anyway, put all that aside. The fact of the matter is that if your senior team are not having decent conversations with each other, then it's likely that the rest of the organisation will replicate that. So if you said to me, how do we create a culture of conversations? I would say to you that you need to start with the senior, the executive leadership team. The executive leadership team is the team where we need to be seeing conversations modelled correctly. And if they're happening at that level, then it's likely that you will be able to achieve that throughout the organisation. Number 8 on the list, and this is a biggie, we're all a little bit fearful of opening a can of worms, or sometimes we won't have the conversation because we might argue that let sleeping dogs lie. Trouble is, of course, those emotions are still there. It's just that they don't have an avenue to express themselves, and what it actually means is that it affects the person's capacity to do their job. So it's better to have a conversation even if people get upset, and as long as you control yourself as a leader, it's best to be prepared to have those conversations. It's no good thinking to yourself, well, I won't raise this with so-and-so because they'll get upset. Well, they may get upset and they may not as well, and how about we just let them decide whether they get upset or not, and let's just worry about what we have to do, which is, of course, to lead them. So I think that occasionally not occasionally, quite a lot, we decide not to have the conversation, the difficult conversation, because we're concerned about how the other person might react. So that's a barrier. And finally, another barrier is the office layout. Many years ago, we moved to an open office layout, and what the open office layout's done is it's disappointed us, because it means that people are actually, ironically, having less conversations or less meaningful conversations. And the reason for that is, of course, they're going to be overheard. You're talking to somebody in an open office environment that virtually everybody can hear it. And that stifles the ability to have a conversation. And by the time you book the room it's too late. So office layout, of course, now architects are really starting to look at having these breakout spaces in organisations where people can have meaningful discussions and conversations. So that's an issue. Now, we're coming towards the end, and if you've got other questions, go for your life. We've got about 15 minutes, and I do want to just touch on these 10 conversations. I want to give you some frameworks that might help you to have more meaningful conversations with the people that you lead. And I mentioned earlier the 5 conversations framework. Well, this is the framework that you see right in front of you now. Now, it looks quite busy, but it's really a very simple concept. And the framework is simply this, that you'll notice on the left-hand side there are 5 months. So the argument is here, this is a framework to help you. You don't have to use this, but it might be helpful for you to guide and inform your future conversations. So you'll notice that what I'm suggesting is that you have one 10-minute conversation once a month for 5 months with each of your direct reports. So what in heaven's name we're going to talk about is the question that I often get asked at this point. And what I would say to you is that the second column is the topic of conversation. So you'll notice that I've got climate review, strengths and talents, opportunities for growth, learning and development, and innovation and continuous improvement. So these are the conversations. So what do we talk about in each of those? Well, the climate review conversation is very much around job satisfaction, morale, and communication. So it's not on this slide here, and if you're interested in the questions, I'm happy to send them to you. But the very first question that you would ask in this conversation is, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being low, 10 being high, how do you rate your current job satisfaction? So that's my first question. And, you know, the person might sit there, and we want them to come to the meeting having prepared for this too, by the way. But, you know, they might say 5. And then your next question, as you could probably imagine, is why? So what you're doing is you're gently opening up an opportunity to have a conversation about their current job description, job satisfaction. Now, we all know that job satisfaction ebbs and flows. One day we have a great day at work, the next day terrible, and so on. But at least it gives you a snapshot of where they see themselves. Now, if it's a 5 and they say, well, you know, that some of these projects I'm involved in are pretty tough, but, you know, overall I don't mind my work. Then your next set of questions are around, do you think it's possible that you could ever be a 6? Because they've told you it's a 5. And, you know, inevitably they'll probably say yes, or maybe they think 5 is as good as it gets. You can then say, well, what can I do, if anything, that might assist you from going from a 5 to a 6? So you see, it's a very, you know, there's no defensiveness about it whatsoever. And you do the same thing with morale. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate morale? And then why, and so forth and so on. And then communication. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate communication within the team? And how would you rate communication beyond the team? All right, so you've got 2 dimensions there that are important. So that's a good conversation to have. It's an easy one, and people generally enjoy that. And then you move on to the strengths and talents conversation. So instead of us starting from, you know, what people are no good at, how about we start talking about what people are naturally good at? And in other words, their innate talent. Now, there's a high correlation between what people enjoy and what they're good at. That's what the research tells us. So therefore, the first question in this process is, what part of your job do you enjoy? Now, I'm hoping there's something that they enjoy, and so do you, no doubt, but whatever they mention will give you a hint or a clue as perhaps where their strengths lie. And so the flavour of the conversation is around how they might be able to use those strengths and talents in a more effective way with other people. So we start on an upward spiral of positivity, not a downward spiral of negativity. And then conversation 3 is perhaps the most difficult or challenging of the 5 conversations, because this is where you talk about areas for improvement. So the key thing here is ask them to come to the meeting having thought of an area of improvement, and don't deal with 25 things because that's overwhelming, but just deal with one thing or 2 at the most, and talk about it, and talk about the barriers. What can you do to help? Now, out of those conversations, that strengths and talents and opportunities for growth, it opens up for a 4th conversation on learning and development. So there's probably inevitably some things that you can sponsor that'll assist people to build on their strengths and, help them overcome their weaknesses. And this isn't necessarily sending people off to courses. It may well be, explaining something more clearly to them, mentoring them, coaching them. It goes on. And then the final conversation is on innovation and continuous improvement. So this conversation is on how they can improve their work area, right? What suggestions do they have to make things better, faster, easier, with greater productivity? So conversation 4, learning and development, is about how do they develop themselves, whereas conversation 5 is how do they help develop the organisation. You see, so it's really, I put a bit of thought behind this, so you don't have to do all the thinking. You just simply have to think that through. Melanie, you're asking, would it please be possible to get a copy of the questions sent to me? I think this would be very helpful for my team. Yeah, good. No worries, Melanie. Look, could I ask you, I'm sorry to be so bureaucratic, can you just send me an email after this, because I might forget, and then I'll just send you that. I could always glibly say buy my book, but I'm happy to send you those, so that's okay. But send me an email. So that's the 5 conversations framework. Now, some people are skeptical and say, oh, look, surely it won't only take 10 minutes. It doesn't need to take any more than 10 minutes, but I have had cases where people have taken more than 10 minutes, and sometimes it's very relevant that they do take more than 10 minutes. But the bottom line is they're designed to be short, sharp, meaningful, developmental and performance conversations that will help you build trust with each of your team members. And so if you're struggling and thinking, oh, look, I'm looking for a framework, well, maybe that's the framework for you. You can certainly use that. I'm more than happy for you to use, in fact, I want you to use the 5 conversations framework. So here are 5 more developmental conversations that you might be doing more of. One of those conversations is a coaching conversation. Now, lots of people don't see coaching as a conversation, but it is really, or it should be. That is between 2 individuals. So I really want people to have those conversations with people, and it's more around how might we do this and what do you need to do next and rah, rah, rah. So it's really about having a dialogue with the person and not just simply barking orders at them. That's not a coaching conversation in my view. It's not even a conversation. It's really just giving an order. Now, mentoring, if you've ever had a good mentor in your career, you'll know the incredible power and influence a good mentor can have on your career. So it's important to keep your eyes and ears open for the opportunity to mentor. So if you're a well-experienced, successful person, I know you're all successful, but if you've been in the workplace for a long period of time, then you may find that people will start seeking you out as a mentor. And it's one of the most satisfying things that you can do. The difference between mentoring and coaching is that coaching is very much based on technical skills, whereas mentoring is more around career. So, mentoring is a wonderful conversation, but you can't, you've got to wait for somebody to, that's almost a reactive sort of scenario where someone comes up to you and wants advice. And if they do, be flattered and be prepared to do that. And that, of course, would be a mentoring conversation. Anything that you delegate to people should be a conversation. You know, I'm not talking about gopher delegation. I'm talking about, you know, a serious challenge that you want to give people. It should be two-way dialogue always, and that's important that the conversations occur that way. Now, the last two are sadly neglected, and I think that you could all spend more time doing these. I don't have any doubt. The visioning conversation is all around giving people a line of sight between what you're doing and the end result. Remember we talked about this last time when we were talking about autonomy, mastery and purpose? This is the purpose conversation. This is about explaining the why of work. This is about giving people a big picture of what it is that you want them to achieve so that they then have a sense of autonomy and purpose in how they do what they need to do. We don't do this enough, and we don't do it enough for two reasons. One is we think the person already gets it, or it'll take extra time and I don't have time. But you'll get great results from that. And the last one is, I know you're all bulletproof, but the reality is you need to encourage people. Why? Now you might say, well, I didn't need encouragement. I've got to the position I have without any encouragement. Why do I have to go around encouraging people? Because people often need it. And we're talking, remember the topic of today is how to get the very best from the people you lead. Just by encouraging them could be something like, thank you, or I know you can do this, or I'm challenging you to bring your best to work with you. So the encouraging conversation is very powerful. So just finally, in fact, I think I might just leave that slide for the time being. I've talked about good conversations. So I've covered the barriers of conversation. I've talked about the 5 conversations framework, and of course I've given you 5 additional conversations. And so you'll never guess, and you won't be surprised what your homework will be, and that is that I want you to organise a regular get-together with your direct reports. Now you might already be doing this, good, but if you're not, then now's your chance to do it. Get together regularly with your reports on a fortnightly or monthly basis, whichever you choose. I don't care. It is a priority. This is not just something you can just slot into your program. This is a serious event, and you need to plan for it. And I want you to have a regular, short, sharp conversation. No, I don't mean sharp as in aggressive. I just mean get to the point. I want you to have a regular conversation with each of your direct reports. You will be blown away at how incredibly useful this is in terms of your ability to get the best from the people that you lead. You have to trust me on this. You have to give it a go. Those of you who are already doing it, congratulations. My challenge to you is to improve the quality and structure of those conversations by incorporating some of the ideas that we've gone through today. Does that sound like a fair deal? I hope so. You'll be amazed. So guys, that's your homework, and I'm going to finish there unless there's any last minute questions. So Melanie, send me an email. I'll get those out to you. You'll get the slides for today from me as usual. You'll get the recording from me as usual. And you'll also get a diagnostic to complete, because remember, as I said at the outset of today, we have the understanding people and their personality session next, and I want to debrief you on that by getting you to complete the survey. No one else has to see it. You don't have to show it to your boss or anything. Just complete it and have it handy next time we meet. All right, so thank you everyone, and I'll sign off here. And as I said right at the beginning, have a wonderful weekend, and you can start this afternoon and get your conversations organised. I hope you can do that. Thanks everyone. Thanks. We'll see you. Bye.